Okay, so hi, Teresa.
Hello.
So nice to see you today and to join us. Well, you and I are here together, kind of in Zoom format, but we're going to have a discussion today about your debut memoir published by Lanternfish Press called The Mason House. And we are so honored to be carrying your book in our store at the Head and Hand Books in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. We're longtime fans and friends of Lanternfish Press. And I would love it if you could just tell our supporters and listeners and viewers a little bit about the book, just like as a little summary to get us going, and a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I am. I'm living in northern Michigan, in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Actually, I just moved back here 2 years ago. I was away for many decades. This is where I was born and raised, and I am Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, French Canadian, and Cornish. That is my heritage. My mother is Anishinaabe. My father was French Canadian and Cornish, and his mother was Cornish. So um, the Mason House actually came about because I spent a lot of time with my Cornish grandma in her house in Mason, which was a small mining community town that was the mines had closed and it was drying up, and she lived in one of the homes. And so she had a big impact in my life. So I really, my whole life, I just wanted to pay tribute to her in some way. And she passed suddenly when I was 10. And so I never really was able to, grieve and process that grief. And so I came upon a point in my life where I was struggling with grief over separating from a long-term job for health reasons. And so I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life, if I couldn't work because my body was kind of not cooperating. And so I decided while I had that time, I was going to write about my grandma.
Mm.
And so it became the Mason House.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's really exciting for those of us who are, thinking about getting a story on paper. It's never too late to do this and to engage with a story that's obviously been resonating with you your whole life, and you've come to it in a way that you can now share with other people, which I think your grandma, the book is dedicated to her.
Mhm.
And she resonated with me as this matriarchal figure. I was lucky enough to have a really strong matriarch in my life, so I love that it became not just a tribute to her, but this like wider, it just branched, if we can use that
Right.
family tree term, into a story about multiple generations, not just about your grandmother.
Yeah, I discovered in telling my story about my grandma, oh, how much I love my grandma and why, and all these little stories about her. It, it made sense to me because I lived it, but to other people, it might not have made sense why she was so important to me, why I was so strongly bonded to her. And
Mm.
so in order to convey that, I needed to go out and tell the side stories and the backstories, and to fill all that gray area in so people understood that. I think that's what I needed to do.
Well, and we talked a little bit about the order of our talk a little differently, but now I think I just feel like her presence should be now invoked with your words. And I'm going to switch it up on you a little bit and ask you to
Okay.
read that passage that you wanted to share about storytelling and your grandma, if that would be
Okay.
okay as our first foray into the passage reading.
Okay, that sounds good. My grandma, one of her fortes was storytelling. She was a really awesome storyteller. Um, and sometimes they were a little scary. Sometimes they were a little odd, but she always had great stories to tell. And living in a mining town, it was filled with mining ruins. There was an old stamp mill. There was a reclamation plant where they were sucking sands from the bottom of a lake and trying to leach out through chemical process what was left, what ore was left in those sands. And there were trestles, tracks, tunnels. There was just all kinds of stuff around town that she didn't want us to be involved with. So she would tell us stories that dealt with all these things. So that's what I'm going to read today. A little bit of that. Okay, this comes from Shuttertown Stories, which is a chapter. One summer afternoon, she told me the tale of Bigfoot. Rumor was he'd been seen on the Q&TL tracks, the ones high up on the ridge. Mason was once a maze of railroad tracks and trestles. 3 different rail lines ran along its borders, crisscrossing one another at key locations. The Q&TL's sole purpose had been servicing Quincy's mining operation between Hancock and Torch Lake. It sat unused now. Its rails rusting, weeds creeping through the track ballast, though I recall the Copper Range and the old Mineral Range rails still saw little activity. He came right through town in broad daylight, Grandma said of the beast as she pointed eastward. Walked right down the highway with his red fur and long arms. He looked like a damn monkey. Why'd he come in town, I asked. That's scary. Who knows? But after he passed through, all you could smell in the air was sulfur. She said he must have been hiding out in the old mine shafts. That's why he smelled so bad. I was cautioned never to wander to the upper tracks without my Auntie Lil, her younger sister, who took us for long strolls through the woods. Sometimes she'd even let us venture out onto the railroad trestle. Not too far, though, only a few feet. We'd grasp the wooden railing and cautiously pick our way from one creosote-stained tie to the other. Lush green treetops swayed dizzily in the gorge below. The upper tracks were full of adventure. Though I was unaware of her motives at the time, Grandma's stories served to safeguard me from mining hazards. The mines had long ago closed, but the industry's footprint had scarred the landscape. There was no shortage of danger to be found around Mason. The mile-long town bordered the holdings of the Quincy Mining Company, once a powerhouse in the copper country, and there were ample ruins in which one might find themselves in trouble. The old stamp mill and reclamation plant were 2 such places, but Grandma had a solution for that as well. You wouldn't catch me dead going in there, Grandma said. That timber wolf just waits up in those rafters with all that fur and those white fangs. She motioned with her fingers to mimic its sharp canines. Where'd it come from, I asked. Why does it stay in there all by itself? It came down from the upper tracks, she said, pausing to strike a match. She squinted one eye as she lit a cigarette. Afterward, she shook the flame out and tossed the spent match into the ashtray on the 3-legged end table. This gave her an air of casual authority on the subject, like a Perry Mason character on television. I had no doubt she knew what she was talking about. Timberwolves are loners, she said, exhaling a long trail of smoke overhead. They live by themselves.
May I ask how old you were when she told you the timber wolf and the Bigfoot stories?
With the amount of memory I have of that story, I would say I was probably 6 or 7.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. That'll stay with you for the rest of your life, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
I
and that
do
was
like
the
your
only
follow-up
one.
question. I like your follow-up question. Why is it by itself up there? They're loners.
Yeah.
Like, I got an answer for you right now.
Exactly.
And it's so vivid. You can imagine her exhaling all that. You can like exhaling the smoke and being this like very romantic figure as a storyteller. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
So and so coming into the next generation with your sister, we were talking a bit about the I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Keweenaw Bay. The Keweenaw Bay. So the Keweenaw Bay Indian community was your sister's employer at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And that was obviously something that was, a big topic for that part of the story. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that experience and having that in your generation, like you and your sister. How far apart in age are you? Are you
That sister is 6 years difference than me.
6 years?
She's 6 years
Okay.
older than me.
Okay. And so you were sort of, you know, looking up to her and hearing her experiences from a little bit of a remove, but still this was your close sister as well.
Right, it was. So for that sister, Janie, who always was very connected spiritually with her heritage, even though we didn't know anything about it or weren't um, exposed to it, like someone who was raised on the reservation might have been. It just seemed natural that she would be the first to gravitate to the reservation, for employment. And she also had a history. She was a nurse, so she had a medical background, and she also was very good about finding support for herself. And in being raised, our story is also about alcoholism. So being raised in addiction, she had went out and found support as a adult child of addicts. And so going to work for the tribal treatment center just seemed like a really good fit for her. And so she's the one that started there. She was living in California and she came back. They needed a house manager, I believe was the title of that job. And I had family living here. I wasn't living here, but other family was, and they were encouraging her to come back. My oldest sister in particular, because they're very close too. So she was just waiting for the right opportunity, and it turned out to be a job with the tribe. So when she went there, she didn't know anything, about traditional medicines or how the treatment center should operate. She had to learn all that, and the tribe took her in and taught her, and she just gained a lot of knowledge that she began to share with us. And it was stuff that we didn't know, so we were really, really hungry for it, because it just wasn't provided us.
I like how you say you were hungry for that information, and it sort of felt even more weighted, I guess, because it was given to you by your own sister, and
Mm-hmm.
that made it so significant and powerful too, I imagine.
And she's very passionate about it, so it's so much better to learn your culture from someone who's living it, you know really truly believes in it, has passion in it, rather than just like going to college and learning, oh, this is what they believe. It's more like, this is what we believe, and it
Yeah,
makes a big
that
difference.
that personal pronoun, like we.
Yes.
Well, I would love to hear. I know you selected a section from the book about this particular time, so I would love to hear that as well
Okay.
for our listeners and viewers.
This one is in the last section of the book, kind of the healing section, I call it, because it does go. The book has a lot to do with grief and loss, and so it takes a while for that to start to turn around. This is some of the experiences that she had. While all this physical plant improvement was occurring, Janie was undergoing improvement herself. She was learning how to operate a native treatment center where culture was an important aspect of programming, including access to traditional medicines and ceremonies central to native health and well-being. Janie, like the rest of us, had grown up without a deep grounding in native culture, but with the help of the tribe and her co-workers, she set out to learn. They would invite me to everything, Janie said, to all the cultural events, and I loved it. Janie began sharing the stories she'd heard, passing them on by word of mouth, the way it had been done for generations. She also began to gift us differently: a native blanket, a dream catcher, some medicines for smudging. Once, after she'd given me an abalone shell and a bag of sage, I just stood there holding them, uncertain. What do I do with this? I asked her. Teach me. And she did. Janie became our conduit to the reservation and its lost lessons. What she shared wasn't just about medicines or gifts or history. It covered all aspects of life, all the bits and pieces of culture and tradition. The past began to make more sense. My family began to make more sense, and there was empowerment in that. The set of beliefs I had grown up with seemed less random. There was logic to it. There was history.
That is so wonderful. I think it's just it invites you to want to know more. I kind of want to know a little bit more about the abalone shell you mentioned. That
Mhm.
is there more detail about that? And just like as a little side tangent.
Well, not in the book, but what you use that for is to burn your sage or your medicines.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a common implement that we use.
And so that experience for her, can I ask, is she still affiliated with the
She's
center?
retired now,
Okay.
so but she still lives, in the county and everything, but she did retire from her position.
Okay. Yeah. And I like how you count. So the book is divided into parts, correct? That you have
Yes, it's in 3 parts.
in three parts. And this is the quote unquote the healing part of the book, the
Yeah.
final. I think that that would be really interesting to talk a little bit since we're talking about structure. I was really eager to talk about a little bit with your choice to begin the memoir. I mean, to go into the memoir genre. You said originally that you hadn't planned on doing that, that was sort of a surprise, and then even where the story took you was also a surprise.
Yes, definitely. I never saw myself as writing memoir. I didn't have interest in memoir myself. I was a fiction writer, and when I was young, I always thought I would do like series romance. I was really into that, so that was my goal. And then I got older, and I thought, well, I'm going to give up on the series romance. You get a little jaded in your older age, and then I thought, well, I'll do fiction. But then I had always wanted to do this with my grandma, so I began to write that story, and like I said, it just grew into something totally different. And um, honestly, even while I was writing the story, things were um, coming to me that I never knew, and just talking to family or researching, history or whatever. It's like, wow, I didn't know, any of this stuff. And so I had to learn how in the book, I just didn't want to blurt it all out. It's like, look what I learned, I had to do it like I was basically learning it in real life.
Yeah.
Since it was memoir, I had to kind of put these little tidbits of information in there, but not explain it fully until I got to the end,
Yeah.
when really was when I understood it as well. So that was probably the most difficult thing about writing it, but it's how it came about.
And did you feel that talking to your family members, was that process, did it spark investigations on their end that sort of branched out in ways that came to the narrative eventually? Or was it really you sort of guiding, even though you were surprised by where it took you, did you feel like you were guiding your family members along with you, or did they sort of like take charge at some point? I'm curious about, because obviously the intergeneration, the generational aspect of it is so wide reaching. So I wonder if you felt like you were sort of like cascading on a river, what was the feeling in terms of, I guess, um, harnessing all of that, all of those people?
Um, I was I was very private about what I was writing, honestly. Um, I it, I wanted to write it from my perspective fully, and then I really did sit down originally and write it fully from my perspective and all the errors that I had in my understanding. So that's how it was first written down. And then I began to, like, when I got to parts where I'm like, well, I better make sure this is true, or this is how it went. Um, in reality, not just from a kid's perspective,
Mm,
then I would call the people involved and talk to them about it. But I didn't really share anything else about it until it was, ready to query. And then I started sharing it with them, and then a lot of them were like, I don't know. I think my older sisters, they kind of knew a lot of that, having been at the tribe, worked for the tribe, so they kind of understood that aspect of it. And of course, they lived through the family issues with us. But just putting it all together and seeing the timeline and how that affected, our the adults in my family emotionally,
Mm,
what brought about some of our dysfunction and stuff. I think that might have been an eye opener to them, because it's stuff that we didn't really look at,
mm.
timeline. It just all seemed to be chaos to us. And so seeing it written down, it it just changed how at least I viewed it.
I think that's really powerful, especially for a reader who might be grappling with similar or, related issues in their own lives, coming to
Mm.
this as a form of feeling empathy, learning along with you as you talked about learning in real time, and perhaps readers who are coming to this is a very important week. This is Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and we're having more and more conversations about why that shift happened to even just that holiday, renaming it to so much more.
Right.
And I wonder, is there any sort of path that you followed where came to these resources that sort of helped ground the narrative as you were learning about your culture and your connection to it, and that other people might find or go to get a deeper understanding?
Um, for me personally, the greatest resource you have is your tribe and your reservation. And that was something that I wasn't familiar with. I spent time there intermittently as a child visiting relatives, or our relatives would come to visit us, but I wasn't immersed in the tribe at all. So I really needed to go there and to learn and to
Mhm.
help me to understand my book fully. And so I think that is the best source I would recommend.
Going back. And
Mhm.
you talked a little bit about language revitalization and that you're in a class now working with the language. And there's even a passage in the book that might relate to that part of your coming to this new understanding. So if you
Correct.
wanted to talk a bit about that, I think that's a really interesting aspect of it too.
Sure. Language is mentioned in my book a few times because it's a really key point to what happened to our ancestors. They weren't allowed to speak their language, but it wasn't that many generations ago. My grandmother could totally speak it. That was her first language, as was my grandfather. My mom, that was her first language, but they were so fearful of her speaking it outside the home that they just wouldn't let her. They really put a lot of fear into her about speaking that, not in a threatening manner, but just like, you can't ever do it. I mean, it was just not something you could do. So she really lost touch with her language because she grew up relying on English. And
Mm,
her friends spoke English, and I guess, to really fit into a mixed community, she was, raised on the reservation, but it was a mixed community, the town, the school she went to. So she spoke English. And then she married very young into an English speaking family. So that was the language that she used throughout life. And so she lost her language skills.
mm,
Um, my grandmother, she spoke English as well, but she had a very different dialect. So you knew that English was not her first language.
mm,
Um, and my native grandmother. And so, and she was sent to a boarding school. I talk about that in the book. We've heard the stories about the boarding schools. She was sent there. Um, and, she wasn't allowed to speak her language. She had a very poor experience at that school. Um, and I think that's a big thing that's in the news right now, particularly in Canada. They are working on reparations for boarding schools. And my grandma's was called an industrial school. It was in Mount Pleasant, Michigan.
Mhm.
But, that's pretty much where the language was taken away. So now, like when I started going to powwow, I didn't start going to powwow until about 20 years ago. And when I first went to powwow, I would stand there and like a fluent speaker of Anishinaabe would come in there and do an opening prayer, which would be very long. They're traditionally very long prayers. And I couldn't even understand a single syllable of what he was saying. It was just so foreign to me. And I felt really isolated in this huge community of Native people and not knowing that language. And a lot of them didn't know it. I didn't know that at the time, but they didn't know it because really only the elders could speak it. And so now, and that was 20 years ago. So fast forward, and now you can get lessons from a lot of different sources. I take mine online
Yeah.
through the Sioux tribe, which is a sister tribe on the eastern Upper Peninsula. There's CDs, there's, the colleges and universities are teaching the language. There are programs where fluent speakers are going into elementaries and teaching the students, which is wonderful because that's our future. If the language is going to survive, those children have to take it forward. It's just so different. And now, from like when I first started to go to powwow, I'd be like, oh, I wish they would speak English so I understood what they were saying, But now I want them to speak Ojibwe, and our fluent speakers are disappearing so fast because our elders are passing, they're walking on, and we don't have as many fluent speakers anymore. But now, so many of us are craving the sound of that language so that we can practice what we've learned. And it's a totally different climate than what it was even 20 years ago.
So when you say the climate has changed, do you mean like there is this not just a feeling of craving, but real action, taking action, going into
Yeah.
elementary schools? That sounds like an amazing initiative. I'm
Yes.
really glad to hear that, especially because a lot of our typical upbringing in the public school system in the US, you start learning a second language in high school, and that's proven is not effective as teaching as young as possible. So I'm really happy to hear that is taking place, and that there's this like real surge of action that's happening around it, not just people coming to learn it, but then doing something about it to keep that next generation connected. Like you can't
Exactly.
sever that
I do
connection.
too. I'm so proud, for those that started that initiative, and that have that in their heart to keep that language going.
Yeah,
They even have immersion schools now, where the kids go and that's all they speak. And so I'm hoping that it's going to continue.
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you want to read your section on revitalization in the book, or did you want to cap the conversation there? Because I would be happy to hear more of the book, but if this is a free-flowing conversation, and if you feel like you want to continue with a final reading passage, that would be great for us, I believe, but that's up to you.
I'm happy to do it. I really like that passage too. It deals with my grandmother and my native grandmother, and how I understood our language differences as a really young child.
Great. Okay.
So see if I can find it here. She used to come and stay with us. We only lived about 30 miles from her, but back then that was a really long way. And so she would come for about a week or so, and she'd stay in my room. My younger sister would usually stay there. I was in the top bunk and my younger sister was in the bottom bunk. But when my grandma came, I don't know where my younger sister went. She must have went upstairs to sleep with one of my older sisters, but my native grandma would sleep in the lower bunk. And so she was very Catholic. and as were we all. And she would do her rosaries each night. And so this passage kind of comes from that. Sometimes we'd bring Grandma Woods home with us to Hubble, and she would stay a week or so. She was a soft, pudgy bowl of pudding, not much taller than me, who spoke with a thick tongue and languid lips, so I had to listen closely to her words. Like Uncle Blue, she had a dry sense of humor and a contagious, throaty chuckle. "Aye," she would say. Her wide, round face smelled of Pond's cold cream and chewing tobacco, which she called snuff, and she always carried a Hills Brothers coffee can as a spittoon. Her taupe skin was freckled with age spots, and her eyes were charcoal like her hair. She wore dresses with the hems at mid-calf and oversized sweaters, her calves squeezed by beige opaque stockings rolled at the knee, her feet usually in scuffs. When Grandma Wood stayed over, she was always given the lower bunk where Katie usually slept. At bedtime, she would kneel on the cold faux wood floor, where I wouldn't kneel, and pray the rosary. I would scoop to the edge of the bunk and peek over at the top of her bowed head. Though she prayed with the same cadences I'd learned in catechism, her beads clicking as she progressed, her sounds were a mix of English and her mother tongue, that of the Chippewa. In her youth, Grandma Woods had been sent away to attend boarding school in Mount Pleasant in Lower Michigan, an industrial school they called it, where she had felt totally alone. At Mount Pleasant, as with all Indian boarding schools, Grandma Woods was forbidden to speak her birth language. They wanted her to forget her Indian ways, to learn new ways, so they taught her English. But her tongue had never surrendered. I heard its rebellion in the recital of the rosary.
I like that we began with your grandmother and we ended there. And I love the phrase, her tongue never surrendered. I don't think that there's any more resonant phrase that we could sort of close our discussion with. And I really just so appreciate you taking the time to share this with us, because we want to be gathered together. It's always a strange, I feel, but again, the power of this is that I feel so connected to the words. And I'm really so proud to have the book in our bookstore. And I hope folks will come check it out. We have it available for purchase on our online website. And that's redundant to say online website. It's on our website. That's not necessary to get. And there it is. It's a beautiful book. And Teresa, I just want to say thank you so much for being such a great advocate for not only your writing process and the subject, but your family and your experience coming to this cultural realization and revelation. I think it's really special. So I really appreciate the time.
Thank you very much. Miigwech.